On the 28th of February in 1777, General John Burgoyne presented a plan for King George III, which he believed would win the war for England. If the British could control the Hudson River, they could cut the northern colonies in two. Burgoyne convinced the king that since the British Navy controlled the American coast and the colonies had very few good roads, movement and communications could be cut by taking control of the major inland waterways. Burgoyne's plan called for Sir William Howe to leave New York City and strike up the Hudson River. He also planned on the forces of Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger to drive down through the Mohawk Valley. Burgoyne's own army would move south from Canada by boat, down Lake George. The three British armies would then unite at Albany, effectively controlling the river.
Burgoyne was confident in his plans and in himself, but things began to go wrong from the beginning. One day after Burgoyne left England, General Howe submitted his plan to take Philadelphia. Philadelphia was where the Continental Congress was meeting and was the closest thing the Americans had to a capital city. The British government approved the plans of both Howe and Burgoyne, but this meant that Howe would not be able to assist Burgoyne. Burgoyne was much admired by his men. He had dash, determination, imagination, and was also a gentleman. In fact, his nickname was Gentleman Johnny. He was also a humanitarian who cared about his men in a way that few 18th century British officers did. But, according to Baroness von Riedesel, Gentleman Johnny liked to spend about half his nights drinking champagne and cavorting with women. Burgoyne let himself be talked out of sailing down Lake George by a loyalist by the name of Philip Skene. Skene wanted a road built through his property and figured that the British troops could build it for him. This road building, the large number of women and children with the army, as well as harassment by American snipers and woodsmen, made for a very slow march. Sometimes the British army traveled only 1 mile a day. Benedict Arnold tricked the British under St. Leger into turning back at Fort Stanwix. Burgoyne didn't yet know it, but he was now all on his own. Still, Burgoyne had a formidable force. He had 3,800 British troops, 138 cannon, 3,000 Hessians, 400 Native Americans, 250 Loyalists and Canadians, and more than 1,000 women and children.
Major General Horatio Gates was the new commander of the American Army in the North. Gates had about 7,000 men, including Continentals, militia, and about 500 expert riflemen from Virginia under the command of Colonel Daniel Morgan. Gates wanted to wait for the British attack from behind his fortifications on Venus Heights. His aggressive second-in-command, Benedict Arnold, was urging an American attack. Arnold believed the British would try to take the unoccupied high ground on the American left. If Burgoyne could place artillery on that hill, he could force the Americans to evacuate their position.
Burgoyne could have and should have retreated while he had the chance. But because of his pride and arrogance and his worry about the morale of his men, he decided to fight his way through Gates and still try to take Albany.
The action began on September 18th, when some of Morgan's riflemen roughed up a British patrol. The remains of the patrol reached their own lines, and the American riflemen were forced to retreat in their turn.
Burgoyne planned a coordinated attack with his army divided into 3 columns. On his left, by the river, were the German troops under General Baron von Ryderson, about 1,100 men. In the center, also with about 1,100 men, was Burgoyne himself, along with Brigadier General James Hamilton. On the British right, under General Simon Fraser, were 2,200 men, mostly elite troops, the Grenadiers and the light infantry.
On September 19th, Burgoyne began the attack. His signal for the action to begin was a single cannon shot. When the 3 columns heard this shot, the entire British army moved forward.
Nobody knows how many times each side attacked and counterattacked. Most of the fighting was done around the British center. Arnold repeatedly demanded reinforcements, and Gate repeatedly refused them or sent far fewer soldiers than what Arnold thought was necessary to sweep the British lines. Finally, Gates did send reinforcements, but ordered Arnold to remain in camp, which he did. The Americans were very close to destroying Burgoyne's center when the Hessians under von Ryderson arrived.
With their band playing, von Ryderson placed his troops in such a way as to look like he had more than he really had. The Hessians charged the Americans, drove them through the woods and back to their own lines.
Burgoyne was saved by von Ryderson. The British held the battlefield and therefore had technically won the First Battle of Saratoga. But the price was high. Out of the 1,000 or so British who were involved in the fighting, 600 were either killed, captured, wounded, or missing. The Americans lost only about half that number. Fraser and his elites arrived only after the battle was over and thus took no part in the fighting. Burgoyne held the field, but had failed to break through Gates.
For the next 18 days, the British Army and the civilians with them were in a miserable condition. Not long after the first shots of the battle were fired, the British and Hessians were deserted by the Indians, the Tories, and their Canadian allies. As they cared for their wounded and buried their dead, they also went hungry. No supplies were coming in. No reinforcements arrived. No cooperation was seen to be coming from the other British armies, and most of the British messengers were not getting through.
One such messenger was Daniel Taylor. Taylor was sent to Burgoyne by British General Sir Henry Clinton. A message was written on a small piece of paper hidden inside a hollow silver bullet. The bullet could unscrew and come apart. Taylor ran into a party of what he thought were loyalists and asked to be taken to see General Clinton.
Take me to General Clinton. He knows me and he knows all about it.
You want to see General Clinton? Very well.
Taylor had discovered an unpleasant surprise. He was instead taken to the tent of American General George Clinton. When Taylor realized his mistake, he yelped, "I am lost," and he quickly turned aside and swallowed the bullet. The Americans saw him do it and ordered him to take an emetic. Taylor took it, hoping it would not be effective. The bullet came up and, incredibly, Taylor swallowed it a second time. He was ordered to take the emetic again, but Taylor refused. The Americans said they would find another way to get the bullet out. Taylor cooperated. The bullet came up, was opened, and the message was read. The paper said that Clinton would not be able to make it to Albany and Burgoyne could expect no help. Since the message was captured, of course, Burgoyne never received it. But Daniel Taylor received a fair trial and was afterwards hanged as a spy. As hopeless as things seemed in the British camp, the reinforcements were flooding into the American camp. Their numbers raised to 11,000 and American spirits were raised as well. Morgan's men picked at the British with their long rifles. Burgoyne's foraging parties were ambushed every time they went out to look for supplies. Cannon fire and alarms went off in the British camp day and night as both sides bombarded each other. The British were made even more somber because it rained a lot.
On October 7th, Burgoyne decided to try to break out. His generals did not believe the attempt would be successful. They wanted to retreat, or at least scout the area completely before attacking. Burgoyne overruled them. He felt he had no choice but to attack immediately.
The Americans knew a lot more about where the British were than the British knew of American troop dispositions.
Burgoyne pinned his hopes on the efforts of Fraser and his elites. These 1,500 men were to circle through the woods to take a hill within cannon shot of the American left. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 British cannons were fired. This signaled a movement. The Americans quickly fell into ranks. The British Army, von Riedesel on the left, Burgoyne and Hamilton in the center, and Fraser on the right, marched forward. They advanced about 3/4 of a mile and had contacted no opposition. The columns halted to realign their ranks at about 2:30. That's when the Continentals under Enoch Poor attacked.
Morgan's riflemen broke through and got in behind the British line. Finding the Americans all around him, the British attack began to disintegrate.
General Gates, we need enforcement at the front.
Send Morgan's riflemen.
Gates and Arnold argued about what to do.
We need something stronger, much stronger.
General Arnold, I have nothing left for you to do here.
Well, if you won't lead it, I will.
Arnold headed straight for the thickest part of the fighting and took charge of the battle. Gates sent an officer to order Arnold back to camp, but this time Arnold did not return. Instead, he heroically charged the British lines time after time. He directed the Americans into the battle as they came streaming out of camp. General Arnold pointed to an active officer in the British lines and said to Daniel Morgan, "That man is a host in himself and must be disposed of." That British officer was General Simon Fraser. Morgan chose one of his best marksmen, Timothy Murphy, to fulfill Arnold's request. The Americans were beginning to take the British fortifications when Arnold was wounded in the left leg by a Hessian soldier. Arnold had been wounded in that same leg the year before. The men with Arnold wanted to kill the Hessian on the spot, but Arnold ordered them to spare him, to take him prisoner because he was only doing his duty. The wounded Arnold was then carried from the field, the hero of the battle.
The Americans had broken the enemy lines. Hessian Colonel Bremen sabred 4 of his own men who were trying to surrender. He might have killed more, but he was then bayoneted by one of his own men, who then himself surrendered. This time the British had to retreat and consolidate. The Americans had captured 10 cannons and inflicted 600 casualties on the British forces. The Americans lost only about 150 men. So, in the 2 battles of Saratoga, also known as Freeman's Farm or Bemis Heights, the British lost a total of 1,200 men. The Americans lost only 450.
With no supplies or reinforcements forthcoming, Burgoyne felt forced to ask for terms of surrender. Actually, he didn't want to call it a surrender and used the word convention instead.
General Gates agreed that if the British and Hessians would lay down their arms, he would allow the prisoners to return by ship to England on the condition that they promised not to fight in America again. Burgoyne and Gates also agreed to a truce to give the British a chance to prepare for the surrender.
During this time, Burgoyne got a message which indicated help was on the way. For a while, Burgoyne discussed with his officers the possibility of breaking off the surrender negotiations. In the end, the message proved to be a false hope, and Burgoyne decided not to resume hostilities.
The Americans may have had now close to 20,000 men in the area. The Americans later said that if Burgoyne would have backed out of the agreement, they would have slaughtered the British army and would have taken no prisoners.
On October 17th, 5,700 British and Hessian soldiers grounded their arms. It was a bitter pill to swallow for many of these veterans, especially the grenadiers. Burgoyne offered his sword to Gates, and Gates politely returned it.
The American Congress disliked the convention agreement and refused to let the British and German prisoners go home. Instead, the convention army was marched to a Virginia camp where they remained until the end of the war 6 years later. However, a number of Hessians escaped on the march through Pennsylvania, settled there, and eventually started families. The American victory at Saratoga is believed by many historians to be the turning point of the Revolutionary War. When news of the battle reached France, the French became willing to send ships, troops, and all manner of supplies to aid the Americans. This victory and help from the French gave the Americans their first real hope of actually winning their war for independence. Benedict Arnold was indeed the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, but his story does not end here. Perhaps he didn't get the credit he felt was due him, or maybe he didn't think America could win the war. For whatever reason, Arnold changed sides and joined the British a few years later. Because he fought first for one side and then switched to the other, the name Benedict Arnold would forever in American history be known as a traitor, and neither side would ever again be able to fully trust him. A shot heard round the world was fired at Lexington Green, and it echoed with the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga.